We have the
I will call to order the Salem Planning Commission meeting for May 16, 2023. Shelby, would you call the roll?
Commissioner Augustine,
Here.
Commissioner Egas,
Here.
Commissioner Fott,
Here.
Commissioner Global, here. Commissioner Griggs is absent, Commissioner Heller is absent, Commissioner Levin,
Here.
Commissioner Slater is not here yet, and Commissioner Vieira Brendel.
Here.
We have quorum.
Are any of you that are, this is the portion of the hearing where we have public comment on non-agenda items. Are any of you here for something other than what's on the agenda? Seeing no one raise their hand, we'll move on from public comment to consent calendar. I was not present at the April 18th meeting. I did listen to more than 50% of stimulating video discussion, and I feel confident I can vote in the minutes if people have me. Then on the consent calendar, can I have an approval of the minutes by Commissioner Augustine?
Yes, Commissioner, but then I move to approve the minute of April 18th, 2023 meeting.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by Font. All those in favor? Say aye. Aye. Oh, sorry, roll on, sorry.
Commissioner Augustine,
Aye.
Commissioner Egas,
Aye.
Commissioner Fott, aye. Commissioner Global, abstain. Commissioner Levin,
Aye.
Commissioner Slater,
Aye.
and Commissioner Vieira Brendel.
Abstain. So now we'll move on to public hearings. Agenda item 5.1, code amendment to page number CA23-03.
Commissioner Lynn, we have a presentation today from a team that's come down from Portland for us. The last discussion about this, I think there was an agreement that the presentation would go before the code discussion, just because of like.
Sure. So for clarification on the agenda, we're moving up the presentation. Yes, and I am on.
We need a motion for that, Commissioner Slater, reorder the agenda.
I'm going in that direction. I'd like to.
And then is to clarify, you're going to rearrange, is it item 6.2?
6.1.
6.1?
Yeah, if we could bring 6.1 up to the current point on the agenda, that would be very helpful.
Yes.
Thank you.
Please submit a motion.
Well, I would move that we move agenda item 6.2 to the front of the agenda for proceeding 5.1.
Motion received. Second. Second by Egas. Shelby, will you call the roll?
Commissioner Augustine,
Aye.
Commissioner Egas,
Aye.
Commissioner Fott, aye. Commissioner Global, aye. Commissioner Levin,
Aye.
Commissioner Slater,
Aye.
and Commissioner Vieira Brendel.
Aye.
I think Shelby will bring up the presentation, please.
I assume the team will introduce themselves, so I don't have to mangle last names.
while Shelby is getting that ready, I'll just make the note that as a special order of business, you're not obligated to leave your name or your board if you happen to live in Salem. If you would, hearing, however, if you would please introduce yourselves and the company you're with as you speak.
My name is Dave Mojica with Scott Edwards Architecture. We are here to share our work that we've done for in Salem. Today I'm joined with John, who's a former property owner and of this development that had a huge influence on kind of the early work that we did with this property. And partnered very closely with our client, Community Development Partners, who is the owner of this development that is currently under construction. Alexa Connor was here with me from my office as well. She is one of the designers on this project. For this development. So Commissioner Slater and invited us to come share this development with the Commission. This project broke ground last August. It is funded through OHDS funds and those funds. 100% affordable. Development that went through a type 2 review process, so it did not come through a type 3 review process to Commission. But he asked us to come share the development, discuss some of the challenges that we face on this development, and ultimately persevere to see this really great forward. Okay. So this development is located off of Battle Creek and Fox Haven. The reason this site was selected by Community Development Partners is they had identified Salem as an area for affordable housing. And so a partnership was created between John Miller, who developed the property all surrounding this particular area. And he had reached out to Community Development Partners to kind of see this site that he had zoned multifamily come to life. So I'll let him speak a little bit about the history of the site.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. John Miller, my office is the old Pringle Schoolhouse in South Salem for about a few cooler, and I've been involved in a 160-acre parcel that this is part of, and I developed it over the years, did a master plan, and I got a 15-acre parcel that I saved and rezoned, thinking that it would be a great place for affordable housing, senior housing. As I got older and things got more expensive, I realized I needed somebody who had better how to do this than I did. So I found Community Development Partners, and one thing that attracted me was their design team, the place landscape architecture and Scott Edwards. They're just some of the best there are, and they're experts in this arena. So I think we had a lot of common values. So that's why they came to this site, and I'm glad they did, because they did a wonderful job in working their way into this community, the Woodscape community that I had developed, and they themselves a real part of it, and a leading part of it. So I'm glad to be part of it. In terms of context of the site, on the north end, in the lower left, is our Woodscape land, multifamily developments for green developments in Oregon. And you can see we have waterways and bioswales. In fact, we did first bioswale and say we're going to have to fight the city to let me do it, but now they take people out and say this is the way you should. And that's been a great learning process. And on the middle, the large one, it's the southern border of the site, and it's Woodscape Park. We built Woodscape phases and the large detention and water quality piece in there, and then the Battle Creek is on the east side of the site. And one of the things that is of interest to me is, I mean, land and developed and designed in Salem for 40 years is Salem does something really well, and one of them, in the lower left, you'll see the sequential Pacific biodiesel plan, which I was part of. It was a groundbreaking there with Willie Nelson, and we brought a lot of outside investment into Salem, and it's the best biodiesel plant, the greenest one around, and it went really smoothly. The Public Development Commission wanted us in Portland, but they made it so hard for us to be there that we came to Salem. So Salem does a lot of things really well, but one of the things that I found is, and on the lower right there is and some of the neighbors, they just did a wonderful job. I introduced them, I vouched for them, and they just took it. And the neighbors welcomed them, saying the neighborhood association welcomed them. That was a real important part of the process, is getting to be welcomed by the community. A couple of snags that I think both the major home builder we're working with, the 200 project in this, which is over 200, is there's a couple of things that Salem could do to make things better, I think. And one is our land use process is pretty cumbersome in terms of dividing parcel, and I would guess that the planning division probably agrees with that and gets more frustrated than we do on the development end. And the other thing is the reimbursement process, where you have offsite improvements to make. It's uncertain and it's lengthy, very lengthy compared to other cities. And if we want to make ourselves attractive to outside investment, we should look at a couple of those things and see if we could improve that. So just a couple of suggestions, but these guys are the design team. I'm going to sit down.
Thank you, John. So I think we'll go ahead and transition to kind of reviewing the design of this project, and Lisa, is nice to see you in person for the first time. I realized after many months of communication. So these types of projects, they do take a large range of teams to make them possible. So not just the vision from our clients who do affordable housing, but also from making sure that we're partnering with sustainability partners, all from the design side, also the Energy Trust of Oregon. And I think the relationship between policy is really important. I think leading up to this conversation, this presentation today, a lot of the conversations with Commissioner Slater were really revolving. What are the challenges with kind of the land use process, as Sean had indicated? Where is it really successful? Where is it a little bit challenging? All in all, I do think working with the city of Salem has been a very positive experience for us, and I think I'm excited to kind of share what we through this two review process that we'll do. So first, whenever we get these sites, early design and affordable housing projects are always going after funding sources before fully releasing full design. So generally, we have about 8 to 12 weeks to pull together a package that is priced, number of units are committed, the funding is committed, and we do that in about 12 weeks. It's very preliminary, and then all of a sudden everybody's locked in. So whenever we start design, the very first thing we do is we evaluate areas of preservation and site constraints. For this particular site, it was relatively challenged from the standpoint of all of the significant hooks in the trees on the site. I think Salem has a great commitment to sustainability and making sure that we're saving as many significant trees as possible. For developments like this, it does make it a little bit challenging. I do think that the variance process and working through negotiating areas where we just can't possibly develop without taking down a significant tree in general, I do think that that is a very positive experience. And I do appreciate the planners pushing back on us and trying to come up with creative solutions. So I think that is an area that I would say was really positive for us. Moving forward from that, a lot of times on these large sites, there are already sewer easements that exist. So the very first part is defining where those sewer easements are and understanding how to define these parcels. So for this particular site, there is a road that we created, so there's Salem Street extension extending from north to south, bisecting the site into 2 phases on the east and west sides, and then kind of logical connectivity through Teal and Foxhaven connecting up to Battle Creek. Early on, we did go back and forth whether we were going to go to planning and have a conversation about potentially doing a secondary access on Battle Creek to the south. What we generally found on this site is it's so steeply sloped, with the high point being to the south, and then the low point being to the north, that it did not really believe that we could get proper vehicular access and that cross connection to happen. So where we landed was doing a looped development and pushing parking out to the perimeter on that phase one site that you're seeing to right here down in this general vicinity. And what that did for us was two things. One, it created a really open space that we could move buildings, that we could position buildings to create the groundwork for a nice open space that could be accessible to the adjacent residents in the existing single family house development. And it also allowed us to create higher access loop that would have parking. And the approach to parking on this particular development was, because Battle Creek is actually higher than this area, the idea was creating kind of a depressed parking zone and treating this with kind of a screening of trees in a similar way that you get. So from an architectural standpoint, we knew going into this development of 300 units between the two phases, and a development that is housing both seniors and families, that this would predominantly be made up of 3-story buildings. So the very first step that we take in any jurisdiction is looking at what the code is sort of driving towards when it comes to development of particular building technology. So up at the top are 2 images from the Salem zoning code, and then to the left is sort of a very distilled down diagram of how we've seen traditional 3-story blockhouses, not just in Salem, but historically across the nation, and how they function. So the general operation of the building is a open breezeway, and really, when we activate it, you can see the image on the right of the zoning code. The activation is usually through kind of balconies on an individual, per individual unit, but we've rarely seen good activity on the ground level. And so one of the things we really question in looking at the typologies and the history of this is, how can we create activity on the ground level? And the driver for that is thinking about single family homes in the area and how single family homes in this neighborhood, a lot of them have front porches. When we've been through the neighborhood, it's near the Pringle School Elementary, we see kids playing out in the yard, and we were questioning, how can you create that sort of environment in a very simple way by modifying these traditional building technologies. So in addition to that, this is sort of just a diagram of how we typically see these buildings laid out. So generally speaking, they tend to be on a graded system. We're going to see a parking. And I think we wanted to really explore both how they can be arranged and what these forms could be. So kind of the first step was understanding that this is a really big development that was going to have dozens of buildings on it. And what we concluded was there's really no reason, there is an economy to scale, but within reason, once a development gets that big, it seemed illogical that you would have a variety of approaches to building massing. So we really started exploring, well, this project's gonna have over 24 buildings, or around 24 buildings. Let's start talking about what are the multiple ways that we can arrange roof forms and very simple massings to create variety, and then talk about how can we clad these buildings utilizing very humble materials to create variety on the site. So the first approach is creating a very small building with a single living corridor and forward-facing gables. But the change that we made to this approach is, rather than just saying that we have the main entry on the center, that we would also provide side entries, and that we would activate these patios, and that we would actually treat them as areas of activity. And the reason on this particular project we were really focused on creating the side patios is because then we realized, well, if you have buildings next to each other, there's an opportunity to provide activated space between them. So really these kind of sets of diagrams of how these buildings can potentially operate was really driving at how do we arrange on a site with this framed kind of approach, and hopefully creating these spaces between buildings. So rather than just thinking about the buildings as objects and thinking of them independently on a site like this, we really wanted to think about how the buildings work together and kind of driving back this idea of community and creating that connected space. So just like any project, we went through a multitude of potential arrangements for this development. But you can see here in our final kind of concept plan, on the phase 1 development, this ring of buildings really shaped up to create this open space. And I think as we move along this presentation, we'll kind of talk about the connectivity and how phase 2 was integrated to this, and then how older adult living and our community center was incorporated. But I'd like to turn this over to Miguel to start to talk about rollout, spatial structure, and organizations.
My name is Miguel Camacho. I'm with Place and with the landscape architects for this project. And you know, we have had a relationship with both CBD and Scott Edwards as partners, and you know, we had a lot of interest of extending our to the community in Salem, and specifically with issues of so it was a great opportunity to try to elevate what those technologies can be. And as they mentioned, this is an opportunity to generate a significant amount of space and really thinking about the relationship of these buildings that want to create between them. How do we use those spaces so that they can engage not only within the development but also where this is going to be situated. So we really put a lot of attention on really the movement and the circulation around the site, and as it was explained early on, the definition of this system for the parking and orienting the buildings in a way that it would lend itself to create this central space was kind of like the driver of how do we articulate the spaces. But then there was also a lot of thought about wanting this development to be a multi-generational development where we serve both senior communities, young families, and how do we create opportunities for those communities to really interact and integrate with each other. So, you know, simple things of like, you know, we put the senior center, senior buildings at the very end, and then the center at the center, so that it's more centrally located so that it serves all the buildings. And you know, we went back and forth, and it was a good exercise of understanding those dynamics. And where we landed was, it's, you know, the metaphor is let's put the senior building at the head of the table and have them be kind of like at that entryway between the walk-ups and the community center, and then articulating a common open space and really create this moment where you foster and you promote that activity exchange. And then, you know, this is in terms of the scale and the size of phase 1. One of the big impacts also was that relationship to the Salem extension and that street frontage. And so we really wanted to make moments of the spaces between the buildings so that they could be also considered as entry points and connectivity from the single family neighborhood on the other side. And as we started looking more at phase 2, really wanted to create that transition between single housing and then this larger area of development. And so we thought not only about the vehicular connections to the neighborhood, but also as we're articulating the parking lots and the spaces again between the buildings that kind of created this cadence and this rhythm of the open spaces, so that it helps you orient yourself, it helps kind of work within the scale of the neighborhood and really emphasize those sidelines, those movements inside. I think I totally forgot that we have this diagrams. All of the things that I just referred to, the expressed in the diagrams right here. If you're paying attention, you. And you know, again, it's working with those technologies again also the condition of space, so that the development is readable and it's easy to orient yourself. And we could talk a little bit more about the countryside and the landscape.
So when it came to citing these particular buildings, on the left and the right here are two of the buildings and kind of how they shaped up after we went through this sort of idea of diagramming. So the first buildings on the left here, We chose to cite the smaller two twin facing gabled buildings. We cited them on the Salem frontage of phase one. And so the decision there was to put the smallest possible buildings fronting the street to act as a transitionary building between the single family neighborhood and the larger housing buildings that we just purely needed from a capacity standpoint. We use these at the kind of back of the development behind these smaller buildings that you're seeing here at the front of Salal. And the idea was to use more of this kind of row house structure to create a screening, to use the building also as screening from the parking that is depressed behind this to Battle Creek. So the idea was we can also kind of create a role and a function to each of these building masses and how we site them on the building. For both of these buildings and all of the buildings on this project, we generally like to work with very humble materials and try to just create very clean forms and organize them. And really part of it is a maintenance-free or low maintenance sort of way, because we realize that the buildings are not just here for today, they're going to be here for decades down the road. Community development will be managing them for at least 50 years for their funding. Choices like using cedar on the ground level of these buildings that are facing Salal, but only using it on the ground level or somewhere where they can easily access it from a maintenance standpoint and cost save. Trying to understand how can we work with an economical material like fiber cement siding in a way with, really it's funny thing like vinyl windows, if you buy them, are 40% cheaper than one, right? And those little simple things like color choices make such a huge impact. So when we designed these buildings, we really went in with it knowing, okay, we're going to use white windows because they're more economical, but how can we use them in a way that they can feel elegant and they don't feel cheap? So like you can see on the buildings on the right, we chose to say, well, we'll use white windows and we're going to use them in kind of a lighter colored facade so that frame just disappears with the facade. But we're going to create these moments where we have to integrate our EHPs for cooling. We know that we want a grill in front of that. We said we're going to use an architectural grill. We want those grills to stay here to be clean for as long as possible. So we knew those were going to be a dark color. So we said it's a good investment to do a black window and create this as a conversely, on the other building, the way that we combated the PTHPs from a design standpoint, and this one was to say, we're going to do the dark grill, but then conversely, we're going to do a dark building. And then we're going to use the white frame as sort of an accent to call attention to kind of create this. So I think there are very simple ways to create kind of elegant structures. When phase two was realized, we had a lot of back and forth on the orientation of these buildings and how they relate to Salal and how they relate to the neighbors behind us. I think on developments like this, we are very fortunate when we have people like Jonathan to give us background on the community and to connect us with the community so that we can do our own independent community engagement outside of the required neighborhood presentations. So we obviously did the required, initial presentation to Cigna, but we also followed up with an additional, I think, over the course of phase two. I think we did probably a total of 6 presentations with them. We met independently with the neighbors behind us, and meeting with the neighbors behind us, it was far and beyond just the requirements to get easements vacated and whatnot. It really was about having conversations about them. We're going to see this building behind you. Like, we don't want to shy away from that. And when ultimately where we landed through all of those engagements was orienting these buildings with a short face facing Salal, that way presenting the shortest possible face of the neighbors behind us. It was actually kind of interesting because on the architectural side, we had initially positioned these buildings similar to phase one with a broad side on Salal, trying to create as much space between the residents behind us and the building. But what they actually came back and said was, no, we actually would prefer this organization that we did in the long run, because they felt like we kind of did some images of what it would look like in their house. And they said, we understand there's this there. And I think it was really impressive to hear them say things like, we understand there's a need for affordable housing. We knew this site was going to be built at some point in time. And I think on the design side, we understand that the people that were behind this development, they purchased these homes, 20, 30 years ago, and they're gonna retire. And so I think it was really important for us to be sensitive. And so this site was more forgiving from the grade standpoint. So we actually did these turn gables on this building, on these buildings, and the idea was to create a building facade on the street frontage on this side that kind of felt closer to the scale of the commercial homes, the adjacent properties to sell, to act as a transition and really create these wonderful kind of patio entrances directly on the street. On phase one, the elevation was higher, so we had to do these kind of stoops, and so we thought this was a really interesting way to activate Salem. In a friendlier way. So, in addition to the walk-ups, we have two other buildings that we cited, as Miguel said, the community center and the senior housing. These two buildings, we chose to site them on the northern end of the site. It was twofold. One, that is the primary entrance of the development, so we felt the community center had more power as being the first building that you see. We also felt that that expression of a one-story building when you pull into the development felt like the right kind of message as you pull into a family housing development. The senior building on phase one, we were a little bit more challenged on. So that building has 42 senior units. It's not assisted living. They are able-bodied. We do have a service provider engaged. That one was a little bit challenging because they wanted all seniors in. And so we really maxed out the size of the allowable by code. But regardless of that, what we chose to do was really position the building with the shortest possible face on Salem. That way, as you're driving up and down Salem, you're seeing the shorter side of the face. But then when you're within the plaza, that we can create this larger expression for the development with this sort of underpass that's creating a gateway between the Starscape Plaza and the park. So I think, and then in addition to that, we are stating these really large oaks on the site and using that as a screening element for the senior building that you can see behind, and utilizing that as a feature on the site. So I think, so this idea of the relationship between trees and building, I think was really critical to developments like this, that we're not just thinking about landscape requirements isolated from an empirical standpoint, but we're also thinking about how landscape integrates with buildings that we achieve in space. So I'll let Miguel speak a little bit more about our landscaping.
We'll go through these quicker. But yeah, the idea is again to reinforce the circulation and the readability of the site through planting. So we're going to look at different layers. So this is basically the street trees, frontages, kind of creating a very distinct landscape on the street frontages and also on the roofs on the back, the parking lots, mostly for readability. But as you move through the site, you start understanding how the site is organized. As we mentioned, there was a lot of existing trees that we wanted to preserve, both oaks and other species, Douglas firs and like also kind of environments that were present in the site. And then in addition to that, we wanted to try to salvage as many as we could. And that was another great partnership with John Miller to use his expertise on that to try to recreate some of the oaks in the development. And then make those feature moments in landscape throughout the site, also phase one and phase two. And then as we go into the development, spaces between buildings to kind of create these moments of flowering trees or seasonal highlight trees that give a little bit more of an identity and a readability to each corridor as you move through the site. And then, you combine them all, it's this system of that if you squint, it's almost like a diagram, some that there's connectivity with the way that you experience the landscape and as you move through it. And that helps to differentiate the kind of repetition of the buildings that it makes each space very because it relates to its context. And not only within itself, but that will be connected to to the phase two elements, to the north, to the Battle Creek frontages. And then also combining that with other requirements, particularly for parking, so that there's always concerns and soft put on screening and vegetation of the parking, but we also want that experience of the parking lot to be very thoughtful, because usually for people that live there, it's the first thing that you come to the house in the morning. You don't have to contend with compact spaces. You want it to be generous with parking as much as possible. And the same thing at the end of the day, you arrive, you have your space and you have your that first moment, last moment during your day was a good one because we wanted to be zero back on parking. So we really wanted to make that compelling space as much as many others that are more feature or more community oriented. So around the community center, the senior center, we focus more on like this needed talent plans that have an educational and a cultural significance to it, and there's also a garden west of east of the community building. And then this idea of the forest also kind of like coming in to the development of the edge with a single housing, preserving as many significant trees as we could here, but also creating a good buffer in terms of fire resiliency and that distance between buildings and kind of create those buffers there. And then with stormwater also, like these basins, in other projects we've done many different approaches, but here it was a little challenging that it had to be all concentrated into one facility to treat a lot of the area. That is something that originally we were looking for ways to integrate it a little bit better, but this was a good way to do it. And we made the most of it to try and create these compelling also landscapes at the entry points.
So to kind of conclude here for us today, I think ultimately the way that we like to approach these designs, from the way that we approach interacting with land use and planning for any jurisdiction, is I think the most powerful tool is the guidelines. And so I think really understanding from a guideline standpoint, this is the type of environment the city of Salem wants to create, I think was a really powerful tool and really wonderful to kind of understand how landscape and architecture can come together to create this sort of series of experiences. This first kind of series of images being how you experience development coming into the development through your vehicle, but then conversely to also understand how you experience this development as a resident, from being within your community space to being in a plaza space, and then moving into these kind of outdoor park spaces, but ultimately creating an idea of community. And in this particular case, a community that is housing multiple generations and creating a scale and a typology that is respectful of its existing surroundings and history of the neighborhood. So with that, I'll open it up to questions or conversations. Thank you for inviting us. It's funny, we were talking about it in office. I think generally speaking, people generally see coming to commission as a obstruction to schedule. So this was a wonderful opportunity for business units. Very little questions. So.
Well, thank you for presenting. It's looks like a wonderful project, very well thought out. Are there any commissioners that have questions?
Not really a question, but I do want to just commend you on the approach and the thought that really went into creating a place that really provides that sense of pride and identity to everyone who lives there. And it's a fabulous addition to Salem. And I'm also an architect, so of course I appreciate the attention to detail and the clear integration of landscape and architecture and what that can mean for the end result.
Thank you.
Yes, second that. I also want to commend you on the public engagement piece of it. It sounds like you're really thoughtful about engaging the community, what they wanted to see there. One thing I was curious about is you spoke a little bit to some of the challenges that have come up in working with the city and kind of how you work through some of this. I was wondering if you wanted to speak in more detail. So especially when we're looking at our development processes, what could be done better in the future?
So I'll speak from the lens of affordable housing specifically. So Lisa and I had some wonderful early conversations. We are very challenged. And I do think this is an interesting topic of policy, because when developers come to us, we do these very quick studies. They don't want to invest a lot of money because they don't want projects to move forward. Then they go apply for funding. Hopefully they get the funding, usually not in the first round, they'll get it the following year. Once they get that funding, they are locked into a schedule from a finance closing standpoint. They are locked into the schedule, they are locked into the number of units that they're doing. And mind you, we half the time do these studies without even a full survey being completed. So we're really challenged on the design side when these projects go live, and we're told, for instance, when phase 2 was funded, it was funded over from lift funds from a bucket of money for wildfire, to create homes that are wildfire resilient. We were all very happy when we heard that. The problem was they told us we were getting that funding came through in the summer, and we were told that we had to close by December. Financing. So when you think about a land use time frame and a design time frame, that is really challenged. We have to run a permitting for these land use. So I think it's a challenging conversation, because fortunately for this jurisdiction, Lisa and Bryce and Brandon were very open with communication and helping us get to where we need to get. But it is challenging because I think I guess it's Fred, we're probably involved in this towards the end, where all of a sudden people realized we couldn't plat the property because we had easements that needed to be vacated. So at the 11th hour around Thanksgiving, there's all this correspondence going back and forth about, oh my gosh, how did people miss this easement? This didn't get vacated. And so that is really a challenge from us, because I've never seen OHCS pull funds away, but the kind of threat is always there, right? And I've never actually seen it come to fruition. And historically, projects do close. Fortunately, these 2 projects, through a lot of efforts on the design side and from the city side, made it possible to close. But I think that's where, when you think about the restrictions that we're given from a funding policy standpoint, what we're asked from as a design team, it's the kind of middle layer is planning and permitting. And I think the hard part is, no matter what we do, I can't change the funding policy timelines. You guys also have your process that purely takes time. And as much as you're talented designers, you need time to design the documents. So I think that's where I think the challenge is aligning various policies and various schedules. And I don't know, when you look at the long road ahead, I do believe that there's an area of improvement there, but it requires a lot of policymakers and designers to be together. And I don't know what that platform is for future conversations on that eventually. Is that helpful?
Commissioner Akins, you have a question?
I was curious about something you said about relocating oak. Did you actually relocate some oaks, and what does that involve? That sounds.
So, yeah, so this site, we saved some existing oaks, but I'll let John talk about that a little bit more. John has saved oaks for multiple sites and has generously partnered with the contractor and the landscape installer for this particular project to these oaks that have been saved from another site. We're working on it to get them actually planted on the site. So John, do you want to speak?
Thank you, Ron. It's one of my favorite topics. We have a tree spade, and we dug a number of oaks from the site that were going to be in the road, so they were okay to take out. They were smaller, but and then we took them back to our Mulroney Indian nursery on the site and saved them there, and then we'll take them back, working, in place to put them in other places than where they were before. So we shipped a 40-foot tall, 12-inch diameter oak to the Alaska Airlines terminal a couple of years ago. So we've done some big ones and some little ones. Have to learn how to do it in the summertime.
let's say big, so we're just.
The 40-footer, this big round that was semi-low in itself. That's risky, but it worked fine. It's a fun process, and the question about conversation about how things could improve Polish homes south of the site and CDP, they work all over the state, and we'd be happy to sit down with the city and have this discussion of our experience in other cities. Is different than here, sometimes good, sometimes not, but we'd be happy to talk about how some of these timeline Dave was talking about, and one of the easements we were working with was a 1940s easement to Pacific Telegraph and telephone, and there was no description of it because they didn't want to let anybody in wartime know where it was. But how do you deal with an easement like that? The company that no longer exists. But one thing about community, it's not just a word to these folks or to me, that Westgate Glen, the townhouse development I showed you in the early photos. I built that starting 30 years ago, and 65 units there. Our vacancy rate is 0. We have a waiting list. We never raised rents more than 7% ever for the law. It's a community, and that's what these guys do. That's one of the common things that made me excited about them coming here. And these community development partners, they develop it. You've seen people like this, and then they keep it and manage it. And so it's a real community. That's just so cool. So if you ever want to have a conversation with some of the folks that work in other cities and learn good and bad about all of this, that'd be great.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm curious, I'm here on Google Maps and to, view the site. And then I looked at some of your maps. I'm wondering how many, when you end up in the final development, how many trees do you actually, or will you have on site?
We did. Sorry, you're putting me on the spot because I don't have the exact number, but we did trees per acre. It was like super high. I don't remember. So the density that we have is significant.
Okay.
So if anything, we're erring on the side of too many of them, too few, and we know that we are impacting an area that had a lot of significant trees. But with all those things we have to balance out, I think that we did the best job that we could, and with a lot of care and thought of what we're providing instead, like there's really no value under the tree, contributes, but there's others of lives that would be affected beneficially here, so I think it's a better trade.
Thank you.
I'll get the number for you. And
No, that's okay. Just it seemed like you ended up with as many or more trees that are actually there to start with.
Any other questions?
I don't have a question. I've had a chance to ask a lot of questions before the presentation, but I did just want to say thank you very much for coming down. I would say up and coming down to Salem for the presentation. We had a discussion a few weeks ago about another multi-family walk-up, and I think there was a sense from a number of us that we need housing, but boy, it would be nice if there was just a little bit more amenities and features to that space. And then fortunately, here we have this. I think is a very good example of what we could get, but also kind of the amount of time and effort that goes into creating a space like this. It's kind of it's twofold. We need it, but it does take more time and more patience, and it sounds like a lot of last minute rush work, tracking down ghost telegram lines, other things. So thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us. I think just with that point, I had a feeling that there probably was some higher development conversation that led to this invitation. I would like to say, just so that everybody is aware of this development, even though it is Title VI, we are providing amenities, but we have a nice site. I do think it's an important method for the future limitations. I think that balance between amenity much of your parking requirements are probably no longer in existence. But that balance between, you know, the reality is people need parking. Between parking, outdoor space and empty space, and it is possible, it is just, it's challenging, so. Thank you. Yeah, for the rest of your.
Thank you so much. So now we will revert back to agenda item 5.1, and yes, between the 5 and 8. Yeah, let's do a couple of minute break, cool your waters, empty your tanks.
That's the next slide.
It's back in order. These steps and.
Thank you, and good evening, members of the.
Sorry, shall we read the criteria?
I will, yes. This is a public hearing to consider code amendment case number CA 23-03 for SRC chapter 900 sign code. The criteria applicable to this application are found in Salem Revised Code SRC chapter 110.085B for amendments to the Unified Development Code UDC. Failure to raise an issue prior to the close of the public hearing with statements or evidence sufficient to afford the Planning Commission and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issue precludes appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals, LUPA, on that issue. Forgot my water. A similar failure to raise constitutional issues relating to proposed conditions of approval precludes an action for damages in circuit court. Prior to the conclusion of the hearing, any participant may request an opportunity to present additional evidence or testimony. The Planning Commission will then either continue the public hearing or leave the record open for at least 7 days.
Thank you. And Aaron, before you begin, I missed another step, so I need to take ownership of that. Conflicts of interest. Does anyone have a conflict of interest or an ex parte contact they would like to declare? Hearing none, I will declare my ex parte contact. As a commercial real estate professional, I was on a short list of brokers in Salem that were requested to provide comment or testimony regarding a specific concern that the homeowners association had about changes to the sign code. It was a generic call to action. There was no discussion on the request. It was just a simple blanket email that went out. I shared that email with staff earlier today.
I have a question, if I could.
Yes.
Do we declare ex partes in code changes and code policy considerations?
You think it's gonna, well, first of all, ex parte, not necessarily conflicts though. You know, a business that was gonna have change in the site code.
Okay.
Yeah, but legislative, it's okay.
Okay, Aaron, now you may continue.
All right, thank you. Good evening, Planning Commission. My name is Aaron Banko with the Development Department. This is sign code, case number CA 23-03. I'd like to introduce to the record staff report, including all attachments and all our public testimony we received today. For the sign code, we held a series of 3 work sessions with the Planning Commission back last year to discuss proposed updates to the sign code. On February 28th, the proposed code amendment was initiated by the Planning Commission with the adoption of resolution number 2301. Notice was provided as required to the Department of Land Conservation and Development to the public. Notice was also published in newspaper. Because the proposed code amendment restricts the development of new outdoor advertising signs in the MU3 zone, a ballot measure 56 notice was also provided to each owner of affected property to that zoning designation. So what we're proposing to do, the sign code amendment, starting with the definitions, are adding a new definition for complex, which will use to replace current definitions for shopping center, office complex, and industrial complex. The new definition will be used to clarify how the sign code applies to sites containing multiple businesses, multiple buildings or structures that are designed to be functionally integrated, regardless of the number of lots or individual ownership. We're updating definitions for different types of temporary signs, including temporary banners, balloons, and rigid signs. Adding a new definition and illustration of primary building wall. This would be useful in clarifying wall sign display area allowances. The sign code currently exempts non-illuminated window signs that are painted or attached to the inside of the window. This was discussed at the work session last year. Staff is proposing a change to this exemption and a limit so that signs do not cover more than 20% of of any window on a building facade that's within 30 feet of a public street, and then beyond 30 feet, there would be no limit. Staff is proposing to eliminate sign adjustments, sign variances, and sign conditional use permits. So sign adjustments are currently in the code, and they allow up to a 10% increase to the height or display surface standard. Sign variances can be used to grant a greater deviation from an applicable standard of the sign code, but require applicants to demonstrate that there are unique or unusual physical conditions of the property. These processes are proposed to be removed. However, adjustments or variances to the development standards of 900 could still be obtained following similar adjustment and variance processes outlined in other chapters of the similar revised code. So on the left is an example of a park installation at Salem University that is visible from the right of way and was classified as a sign. The sign code variance was required for this installation to increase the number of signs, freestanding signs allowed to the campus. A variance per chapter 245 could also work in this case to grant that sign placement there. Sign conditional use permits are proposed for removal and will be replaced with additional development standards related to the hours of illumination and separation requirements requiring minimum distances between the illuminated sign and adjacent residential signs. So the example photo shown on the right is an electronic display sign that could be found in a residential zone. The current code requires the sign conditional use permit for. So with the updates, just a sign permit could be obtained for this installation, assuming that it complies with all those standards. For general illumination standards and electronic display signs, we're adding a new prohibition for devices which use light to project an image onto a surface such as a wall or sidewalk. We're adding and clarifying that signs visible from and within 100 feet of an adjacent residential zone shall not be externally or internally illuminated. And we're changing the method of measuring brightness, which the code currently requires unit of measurement in nits, points of foot candles. This method has several advantages. They're outlined in the staff report, including ease of measurement, providing a method that's in line with the recommendations of the International Sign Association. For temporary signs, we're updating the definitions of each of the types of temporary signs we have. Clarifying general development standards, permit applicability, and display time limits. And we're creating a new allowance for sidewalk signs to be placed on the public sidewalk in areas that are outside of the central business districts. For permanent signs, we're updating the maximum height allowance for signs that are placed on flat roofs, updating the standards or the standard for projection for wall signs that are on walls in a public alleyway. Staff is not proposing any changes to murals. You see an example here on the left of a recent painting on a building here. Currently, there is an exemption in the code for public murals, public art, and street painting when they are approved under the rules of Chapter 15 by the Salem Arts Commission. Murals that cannot meet the requirements of Chapter 15 could be considered signs and would be regulated under the sign code. City staff is not able to make content-based regulations, cannot distinguish between works of art or other forms of speech. And so the most common issue that we run into on murals is their size. Painted murals often occupy the majority of the building wall and exceed maximum display surface allowances as wall signs. For our zones and our overlay zones, the proposed amendment will reconfigure, update, verify the development standards applicable to permanent signs. The staff report and draft code amendment identify each of the proposed changes. In general, the goal is to restructure the permanent sign allowance into groups of zones that have similar characteristics and to provide a consistent organization method of the development standards applicable based on use for each section. In general, the amendment results in display area allowances, height allowances that are either kept at a similar level or reduced. However, greater flexibility is offered on what side of a building wall sign all signs could be placed. The proposal also updates the menu board allowances for businesses with the drive-through service line. The current code allows one board drive-through lane, and the proposal will allow a maximum of two, but will provide a maximum display surface allowance for the combined total of both signs. And outdoor advertising signs. The proposed code amendment clarifies measurements for minimum separation between outdoor advertising signs between themselves and then between dwelling units, as well as spacing and density requirements. Staff is also recommending that outdoor advertising signs be a prohibited type of sign in the MU3 zone. The Salem project approved in 2022 resulted in updates to zoning and comprehensive plan designations for several properties within the city, and removed some overlay zones where outdoor advertising signs were prohibited. Then the former South Gateway overlay zone in particular, the large number of properties were rezoned to MU3 and are currently eligible for this type of sign. This was an unintended outcome of the Salem project. There are several existing outdoor advertising signs in the MU3 zone. If the amendment is adopted, these will become non-conforming signs that may continue to be used and may continue to be repaired and maintained for their lifespan. But they would not be able to be replaced if they're removed. So we did provide a notice to as required. We did get some comments too. Some of the concerns were with the proposal to prohibit outdoor advertising signs related to murals, which we talked about earlier. There was general concerns about the amount of temporary signs in the city and sign enforcement. We have our enforcement officer that requires here. And then there was also concerns we received about light pollution. Staff is recommending that the planning commission adopt the facts and findings as recommended. I recommend city council adopt an ordinance bill for the proposed. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Any questions of staff?
Can you expand a little bit more on the mural that was used as the example, permanent signs? Yeah, I saw this and I was given a lot of hope, I think, around the idea of public art being more readily accessed throughout the city, and I'd love to see more murals implemented. But I'm curious, for example, is that outright allowed mural, or
So if this was to be regulated by the sign code, it would be too large. The display surface again occupies most of that building wall. And if you look at the sign code, it gives you a much smaller allowance there. So the applicant, they have a few choices. They could apply for a sign permit, but be subject to the restricted size, or they can seek approval from the Public Arts Commission, which would exempt it from the sign code. So we wouldn't look at it, we wouldn't apply the size limits or the permit requirements. That approval would take place to the Arts Commission. I think they're in the application.
so technically it's not allowed necessarily, it's just possible.
The
Is
sign
there a way
in
to-
particular,
Yes.
it's going through the application process with the Arts Commission.
Right.
Any other questions of staff? Commissioner Davis?
Yeah, I have to admit that my areas that I'm looking at are temporary signs and particularly lawn signs, just because that's sort of a pet peeve of mine, particularly related to elections. But in all cases, regardless if it's elections or not, there is an issue of signs not being in the public right. And it seems hard as someone driving around and you know where the public right of way actually is and is not. There are often signs in areas that are in the space, green space, let's call it, in the space between the street and the sidewalk. Is that generally right away or,
Yes, I would say so.
okay, so we just had an election. We're, in this case, and we had one in November. Does this change any, did this change any prohibition?
No, it doesn't. The sign code currently prohibits signs in the right of
Okay,
way.
so my question then is, how many violations did we find for signs in the right of way?
Stephanie is our sign inspector. It's more than a full-time job collecting illegal signs, but we'll ask Stephanie to tell you about the volume. So,
Yeah, I'm just curious if there was any. I know that it's not your entire job, but during election is a time when signs go up and most likely to have violations. I'm just wondering if any violations were actually found.
So in the last couple of months, I haven't had the capacity to pick up right of way signs. And so you probably noticed a considerable difference. I've been trying to make it a priority to go and pick them up. I would say prior to that, I would go out at least once every other week and fill up my truck with signs around town that were in the right of way. I have lists of people that I contact, and some of them are repeated contacts, some of them, and so they get warning on violations, some of them it's outreach on education. This isn't allowed here. Call the city maybe if you have questions about that.
Are there any fines for repeated violations?
There can be, yes, and in order to get your signs back there.
Okay, thank you.
Stephanie's doing 2 jobs right now, which is why she doesn't have capacity. Our zoning inspector left, which is hired in one that was that. So normally Stephanie spends her job as the sign inspector. So she reviews sign permits, does inspections of new signs, and then does all sign compliance. But right now she's also doing zoning inspections, which we thank Stephanie for her help on that. And obviously it's a year-round job picking up signs. So a lot of them are, you asked specifically about election signs, but we get more of the like people, advertising their businesses, or we buy cars, we buy houses, or we're just somebody putting it in front of their business and where they put that at. One of the things in the sign code is a proposal to have a permits, so you can put your sign in the right of way if your building's built all the way up to the sidewalk. If you have no land that's not your building. So we allow that downtown, but outside of downtown, we don't allow that. So we have areas, Edgewater, State Street, North Broadway, and all these other areas we zone for mixed use where we want to see the buildings built out front. That we want to allow people to put during business hours, like we're open or special or whatever signs. So we put that in there as a proposal. Maybe Erin, you could talk about the outreach you do to candidates, because we do outreach on what's allowed when we get to election season.
Right, we do have letters that we send out in advance, reminding folks what the time limits are. Reminder not to place signs in the right of way that need to be placed on private property with permission of property owners. So we do send that out to the folks ahead of elections.
Well, let me just respond here. I understand the constraints and the staff issues. But assuming at some point we did have the capacity, it seems to me that we know when the elections are. We know that there are going to be, likely to be, lots of violations. So it seems to me a time when we might concentrate some enforcement on it, because the best deterrent for decreasing the amount of violations would be for a concerted effort during the elections to take down those signs. And so I'm not trying to be critical of anybody's work or anything of that sort, just to point out that if enforcement is an issue, that, and because we know a particular time when it's going to be reviewed, that it's a perfect time to concentrate some enforcement. Because it's pretty clear they're not supposed to be in the right of way, and I constantly see signs from either side, which are in the right of way.
Yeah, I think we get the best compliance with folks that are running Salem City Council, because they violate their own rules. When we talk to candidates, they generally say that they try to pass on the message to their volunteers about where and where not to place signs. One of the problems we have is that the signs that are placed are so cheap to make that people aren't paying. They don't care, right? It costs too much to pay to get the sign back, and we are required to keep their sign for, is it 60 days or something, 30 days? 30 days. So we have, we just store signs and we keep track of when we got it, when we can throw them away. So it's kind of, I understand what you're saying, but also it's just kind of a nightmare to do all that in case somebody shows up 29th day and says, I do want to pay sign and get it back.
Yeah, but lawn signs are expensive, generally. Individually, it's an expensive individual item, and I think people don't like paying for the sign in the first place and then having to pay to get it back again. Yeah, it's another deterrent.
Commissioner Slater. Thank you. So first, I will say that I proudly disobey and plant my lawn signs for election season right in the planting strip. So Ron, you can come over and take them from me if you really want to. Do it late at night. So I had a couple of questions just about the art issue. So my understanding that sculpture that's installed in view of the right of way requires a sign permit.
It's intended to attract the attention of the public and you are visible from the right of way, it can be considered a sign. So there's a few routes that you can go. The Arts Commission does have process with public order, which would be on the murals. It's receives approval from the Arts Commission with the exempt from our sign code. If not, again, staff can't make a determination on content, whether it's a sign for a business or a piece of art. So we regulate it as a sign.
I thought I heard you say earlier that you can't regulate for content.
Right, we can't.
You cannot. Okay. So, okay. What is the public art process? It's public art
Through the Arts Commission.
Well, they have a public process, so you can apply, right? So there's a few things. So one, for the city, they buy art for the city or for the public, and solicit artists. And so some art downtown or even art district, right? That's owned by the city. Also, somebody wants to donate art to us, they consider that the city should accept that, and then where it would go on display, maintain the art, and then keep money for keeping the art in good condition, right? And like just things that are outside that need to be repaired all the time. Beyond that, somebody can apply for public art, and then the commission can determine if it meets the criteria the council's adopted for public art, and then the city should accept it from art collection. One of the problems with murals there are a few problems. One is they're usually painted before anyone asks, right? That's like in this example. And then when we enforce on the sign code, then they say, oh, I'll approve that art commission. And it may not be art the art commission wants to accept into the public art collection. And then you have to have a city easement on it, and then money must be given to the city to maintain it for a certain amount of time for a mural, for example. And so it can be a high hurdle for folks to get that process. As far as like a statue or something, that's a little bit different. If an artist is donating it, there's a location for it. We don't generally require them to use money for it. We accept it into them, but it has to be within the budget of the art commission. If we need to commission a pedestal for it, like on the sidewalk. But they do have public meetings, a public process, so anybody can attend the art commission.
So now I'm more confused. So if I want to put out my Swiss gnome collection and my my lawn, which is beautiful, from the public, would that be considered a sign, a sculpture?
I mean, potentially.
And then I'd have to go to the Public Art Commission and they would have to accept it into the city's collection. And then I'd have to pay them to maintain.
Probably not, but I mean, potentially.
This seems problematic.
So a sign, yeah, a sign is anything intended to attract attention, right? And so there's many court cases we as staff can't say, oh no, that's art. This is art. But then if KFC draws chickens on the side, theirs isn't art because that traces the business, right? We can't make that determination. And so it gets into speech, not able to regulate speech in that way. So it's kind of yeah, it's complicated and it's messy. So as planners, we want to say, we don't care what you put up there. It can only be this size, right? Or it can only be this bright, or it can only be, that's it. If you want to do something else, go talk to the art commission and take that back.
But it sounds like the art commission needs to accept that into a public collection. They can't just say it's art.
Absolutely. So I think the statue, I think that Aaron Hood was a Willamette. Their art was not for the city, right? And so they went through a variance process to have additional signage, freestanding signage, so that it could be approved. If they had put it more interior to the campus, something we couldn't see it from the right of way, they wouldn't have to do that. 'Cause it's not lit up or anything like that, but it's close to a public sidewalk, and so we went through a variance process just fine because it's not city owned art.
Yeah. Kind of
Follow-up, yeah, but
a different topic then. So we heard some testimony about real estate signs that last over a year. Have we addressed that in this?
We didn't make any changes to the portable sign allowance. So right now, our rigid sign allowance, currently they can be there for 1 year. We're not making any changes to that time limit. I'm not sure if we've received complaints or had to enforce any sign that exceeds that 1 year period. And I think if a sign is removed, another 1 year period would start on that too.
So they take a break for a day. And then more, okay. Gotcha. Last one, okay. So on the question of outdoor billboards on MU3, we had a lot of testimony on that. Where are we falling on that one?
Well, staff is proposing that we prohibit sign, but outdoor advertising signs in the MU3 zone.
Okay. So, and then the testimony and response has been objections to just that approach. Okay, I just want to understand. We were trying to address it, or, okay, thank you. I'm good.
if nobody has any other questions, I have a few that I'd like to ask, going back to the murals. I vaguely remember from the work sessions that at one point there was some conversation I thought about in putting some language in regarding murals to the sign code. Is that a hallucination or a dream I had?
It is an option, and the one thing we could explore doing is creating a separate allowance for painted wall signs, and that would be different than a normal wall sign, and maybe not restricted on size. If we do this, again, staff cannot regulate content, so whether it's art, whether it's corporate speech, whether it's personal speech. Anybody can come in and get a permit and have that same allowance apply to their side, and it may provide a pathway that's there's less resistance than to go to the Arts Commission, so it may take murals away from the Arts Commission.
That was something that I was struggling with. I really wanted to see some language because I feel that something that is lacking in Salem is public facing art, not public art. And so diving into the sign code and reading about murals, I was really disgruntled. I had a really good wall, retaining wall that faces the parking lot of my building. But technically, I guess you could argue you could see that wall from the end of Leslie Street. And it'd be a great place for a mural, but going through the process, it's a 15-year easement that you grant to the city for protection of your wall. And yes, they will maintain it, but you're also obligated to go touch up and repaint. And if there's graffiti, you have to deal with it. So there's a lot that goes along with that. And then biggest hurdle is that I read was that it is the subjection of the Arts Commission if they want this as a piece of their public art. And one of the issues I had was, I don't want this art on my wall for 15 years. I want it on there for like 7 to 10. And then I want it to change out, and I want to bring another artist in. So I find that if we're going to do an amendment to the sign code, I would certainly lobby hard that we ask staff to put in some language that allows murals to go through the sign code. If nothing more than the time restriction that is put on public art. The 15 years, that's a difficult timeline for a lot of people to deal with on the logistics side. So I appreciate, Aaron, you clarifying some of the issues about and the potential about what could be done with murals. There was another item that I had a question about that was related to the signage on glass. And this one also caused me pause and worry as it relates to businesses that I work with and placement, and a lot of them take liberty with glass. The 30-foot setback from the street does help a lot because most buildings, at least suburban, are already 20 foot back from property line, and then from street, there's usually in a lot of cases another 10 feet. So there's a lot of windows wouldn't be, but where I see this is kind of being geared towards, and I remember comment about was more in downtown, and Reed Opera House was one building that was particularly noted. So the reduction to no more than 20% of any window, where did that number land, and was there conversation about allowing more? It seems like it's a benign subject to me, but I like vinyl glass. So, well, can you elaborate on how the city got to that 20%?
I think the 20% was part of that original work session. So the staff was to the planning commission there, with no other limits of this 20% occupied anywhere. So during some of the feedback from the work session, we explored that a little bit more, tried to come up with a standard that would both address the concerns about, we have buildings next to walkways, how do you gauge pedestrians with the building use. So really protecting that space right next to the street, and then balancing out maybe it allows for a larger size here.
Okay. Related to that, the obscuring film on glass, will that be considered in that square footage of signage? I'm thinking of a salon owner that has customers that want to be able to see out, but doesn't necessarily want people to see their feet as they walk by, and so they put obscuring film and then their logo. Would that obscuring film be included as signage?
That would be, there are some overlays that have VT requirements for the windows, so transparency limits. If you put a film on there that's too opaque, it may violate those provisions. If it's black or yeah, I think it would be part of the sign allowance too. So what they would take away from that 20%.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any other questions. Anybody else? Okay. So if we got our questions of staff, then we get to go on to neighborhood association. I don't see anybody from the neighborhood association here, but I'll wait for a cricket. Okay. And then we get to move on to those that have signed up for public testimony. So I will read your name off, and if you would come to the podium, and then you each have 5 minutes. And yes, Dan Drew. Which is state your name and your address or order for the record.
Dan Drupa with Outfront Media. 715 Northeast Everett Street. So I submitted some testimony in writing for summaries for here. First, I'm sorry, thank you for this time. Our concern is specifically related to the prohibiting outdoor advertising signs in MU3 zones. After reading our Salem documents, I think that it's unintentional, perhaps, that the outdoor advertising signs are being prohibited there, based on the definition that the city has chosen to use for MU3. It says that MU3 would be the same as commercial retail, was previously commercial retail for signs. So in this instance, we would be prohibited from operating billboards, shouldn't say operating new signs in those MU3 zones, which would be much more restrictive and encompass a much larger area than what's previously prohibiting outdoor advertising signs through the overlay zones. So I think if the intention was to merely mimic what was previously an overlay zone, what's proposed goes vastly beyond that, and that's where we have a concern. Again, the use being the same as commercial retail, and I believe this is the case. Maybe I can confirm, but MU3 going forward would allow for cell phone towers up to 100 feet in height, but it wouldn't allow for an outdoor advertising sign 35 feet in height. So I don't think that that's consistent. I don't think it's the intention of our Salem project and the intent of promoting redevelopment. As Commissioner Levin mentioned, they're seeing probably the written testimony from the Millers Association and the Chamber about concerns of outdoor advertising signs being conforming uses going forward, how problematic that would be. First off, it would prohibit sign companies from the flexibility that they would have in terms of locating the signs. If we had a 10, 20-year lease on that property and the sign company knew that they couldn't relocate that sign, if they lost the sign and be gone forever, there wouldn't be any motivation to work with the developer for the redevelopment, which I think is a major intent and desire for our Salem project in general. So I think the other perhaps unforeseen issue with non-conforming uses is that there could be a financial impact. If the city of Salem were to be doing a project that would require the sign to be removed, that's a non-conforming use, then the sign company would have a claim against the city for reimbursement of just compensation, loss of revenue. If the sign was, if it was not non-conforming and the sign company could relocate that sign, then the city would most likely just be responsible for the cost of materials as opposed to the cost of the revenue going forward. And most of these MU3 zones are now under the National Highway segment from the MAP 21 project, which means that they are also subject to the outdoor advertising sign code at the state level, which clearly identifies and calls out what the just compensation requirements are. So our suggestion would be that you allow for outdoor advertising signs to be permitted in the MU3 zones and continue to let the spacing requirements that are currently in place govern the amount of signage that's in those areas. For example, our company has built two new advertising signs in the last 10 years. So I don't think that the system is necessarily broken as it is. I understand that those overlay zones maybe in the past were treated differently, but now that they're MU3, I think that there are appropriate areas for signs. It's where the public expects to see billboards in commercial and retail space, even abutting I-5. And it's where advertisers want to advertise their brands. So that would be our suggestion. The easiest resolution in terms of sign code cleanup work. That's all.
Thank you, and just under the 5-minute mark. Any questions? Okay, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Is it true that there would be a just compensation plan for making existing billboards and non-conforming use?
So at the state level, and that's codified. So if ODOT or a state agency, and usually when those takings happen, it's usually a combination of local and state. Then there's a procedure in place that's required the condemning party to go through to identify what that loss of revenue is. Does that answer your question?
Is that true for, even if we're not condemning the billboards though, but just making them non-conforming and allowing them to?
No. It would only be in the situation where they were impacted as part of the project. You know?
Which we're not intending, right? Is that correct?
Correct, it would just be making them more.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? One more.
Thanks. This is for both of you. I'm trying to sort through the phrase unintended consequences, which both of you have used. Recognition that this issue is an unintended consequence of our Salem. The implication of that to me is that staff looked at it and said they had no other choice. So I'm just wondering what, if it was an unintended consequence, what did staff look at, or what could be looked at as a way to address it, or are we saying, well, it's an unintended consequence, but there's nothing we either can do or want to do about it?
So I think when I said that, during our Salem process, there wasn't a policy discussion around, if we remove the South Gateway overlay zones, that also means that we're opening up an area of land that wasn't able to have billboards, now they can have billboards. One of the difficulties of a large project like this too is, you're updating the code. You're looking at uses rooted in CR zones and comparing them to MU3. The regulations for billboards are contained within the sign code. It wasn't the primary focus of that project. So again, when the change happened and the ordinance eliminated that prohibition, again, it wasn't really part of the discussion. And the purpose why we're bringing this to the planning commission is so we can have that policy discussion about where these signs should be located.
Okay. So staff is not taking a position that there is nothing we should do.
So our position would be to prohibit billboards in any MU3 zone.
And that is because of?
Because a lot of the properties that went to the MU3 designation were within overlays that had prohibitions on billboards. So one of the examples you see on the slide here too, outside of South Gateway, there was an overlay in West Salem General Industrial overlay that prohibited billboards. So in the time after our Salem, we've had 3 billboard applications, 2 in South Gateway for new installations and 1 over in Salem. In areas again that before our Salem prohibited them.
Okay.
Any other questions? Thank you so much. Next up, we have Chris Zukin.
Thank you, Chris Zukin. The address is 5525 Cherry Heights Road in Dallas, Oregon. I'm the general manager of Meadow Outdoor Advertising. We have 4 billboards in Salem that will be affected by the prohibition and the zone change. 3 are on commercial, 1 is on private. And I do think there is a solution to this. If billboards were only prohibited where there used to be an overlay zone, solve the potential problem of new billboards being built where they used to be not allowed. Our primary concern is that if billboards are prohibited in all of the MU3 zone, our existing billboards become non-conforming, which means we could not rebuild them, trade them. In the event that the property is developed, we could not relocate them out of the developed area. They have to be removed. And the other situation in which a billboard cannot be relocated would be a condemnation situation, in which either the city or the state is widening the highway or road work. If they're non-conforming, we could not relocate that billboard. Either the state or the city would have to pay us just compensation based on market value. So those are the reasons we are fearful of prohibition in the current zoning which is allowed.
Thank you. Questions? Any questions? Lisa wanted to clarify something real quick.
I did, and then Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, but we do have 2 provisions in the code that apply to all non-conforming signs. One says that non-conforming signs can be structurally altered, provided the alterations do not result in a change to the display area, height, or setback of the non-conforming sign, and provided that the cost of alteration does not exceed 50% of the replacement cost of the entire sign. So I wouldn't say that non-conforming signs can't be maintained or upgraded. We also have clarified in the code that non-conforming signs can be reconstructed if they have to be moved for construction or repair of public facilities, including sidewalks, roads, and public utilities. So long as the degree of the non-conformity is not increased upon reconstruction, and the reconstruction is done within 6 months following the completion of the construction work. So I don't know if those 2 provisions might alleviate some of the concerns, or maybe those provisions need work that could help alleviate some of the concerns. When we wrote that and worked on changing that language for non-conforming signs, we weren't necessarily thinking about billboards, but we have a lot of people around town that have non-conforming signs. I think since the 90s, the city's had a push towards decreasing the amount of signage allowed, especially in what used to be overlay areas and all our mixed use areas. Obviously, those areas were generally developmental. The city decided they should be mixed use. And so a lot of people had taller signs than they'll ever get to build under today's code, or their signs really close to the street where you couldn't today. And so we do have people maintain those signs. And we've struggled with people that have a non-conforming sign and a road project is happening and they want to just move it a little bit, and the city's willing to pay to move it a little bit, and we're like, well, can't, you know, you're 3 feet from the sidewalk today, but you can't just move it and still be 3 feet from the sidewalk, which is why we put that section in. As long as you're not getting less non-conforming, we think it's okay to accommodate that kind of maintenance and reconstruction of signage. And so that would also apply to billboards if they become non-conforming, if this amendment were to pass. So I just wanted to point that out, because that might, in my mind, help address some of that. And that's on page numbers. It does not, it's under section 900-210, non-conforming, unsafe, abandoned, or prohibited signs. In the sections I read were B and E. Anybody wants to look at that? I don't know if Eric, if there's anything else we would add on the conforming signs.
Thank you. Okay, last person I have signed up is John Fitzmaurice. Name and address and 5 minutes.
I'm John Fitzmaurice. I'm the real estate manager for Lamar Advertising. I live here in Salem at 2838 Harding Court, Northwest, and our office is here. I had worked in the billboard business for 30 years. I started in Salem and have worked in Salem. during that time. And we want to go on record to say that Dan has submitted some objections, and we want to concur with those objections on record. But we also want to touch base on a couple of things. In that 30 years, the code has been fine. I've never seen a proliferation of billboards. The city has a good spacing ordinance right now. What is being proposed in the MU is basically going to kill the industry. We make our money by putting our signs in highly populated commercial zones. And we're not commercial, or we're not sign builders. We make our money by advertising. What's up there are businesses in Salem. They utilize our signs. We have a waiting list for a lot of our signs right now. Billboards were looked at one time, were very friendly. It's not that way anymore. You look at that billboard in that picture, at one time that was pastures and orchards and fields. Now it's a commercial zone. There's buildings going in all over out there. Those areas where there were overlay zones have changed. So we would like to see, if you're going to make any changes, like I heard earlier, reenact the old overlay zones, but leave the rest of it alone. It worked fine before, and I think it will continue to work fine. You have the spacings of the city, we have the spacings from ODOT. You're not going to see a billboard on a billboard. The spacings that are in place now prevent that. And with that, that's all I have.
Any questions from commissioners? I have one. What is the spacing?
500 on the same side of the street and 250 on the opposite side of the street. So and I think it's 3 within a mile. Is that correct?
No more than 3 within 1,000 foot section.
So they're spaced out.
The area in Salem where this affects most commonly, I understood, was on South Commercial. How many billboards are there now?
Lamar has some that are north of this area that he's talking about, the gateway. That was never an overlay. This where our signs are now is not part of that. The reason there's application out there now is because the city's going to change the ordinance. So people like ourselves are like, well, if you ever want a sign out there, you better get going, because there's never going to be one if this ordinance is enacted. So it's actually pushed our industry to move faster to actually try and build this something, but we still can. So once it's gone, it's.
Thank you. Any other questions of staff before we go to deliberation, comments, discussion?
I just have a question, Lisa. Is the intent of this just to reduce the amount of billboards in Salem? Is that what we're trying to accomplish with this?
I think we're trying to correct what we see as a mistake that we made. The city's had a long history of limiting billboards. We don't allow many urban renewal area. The city had a moratorium for a long time. In the late 80s, we were redoing our code and we were trying to decide what to do with billboards. Out of that came a moratorium for a prohibition in all urban renewal areas. Many zones already that don't allow it. Many of the overlay zones, specifically when we did that work in the late 80s, they didn't want billboards in the gateways to town. South Gateway was created to beautify that area. Generally, it wasn't a mixed use overlay. And so we feel like we didn't necessarily realize that change happened until all of a sudden we started getting a few applications and inquiries about billboards in South Gateway, where in the past area was been able to say, like, no, I can't have a billboard there. And it was like, oh, oops, can't tell you no. And we didn't highlight that during our Salem. We didn't realize, like Aaron said, it wasn't a policy discussion. Planning Commission, we didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about it with the council. So when we looked at this, we said, well, we have to propose something to fix it, right? To at least bring it forward as an issue. And what we came up with as well is MU3, and we did have a long discussion about should we bring it forward as a prohibition in MU3, because that's not just this area, right? It's parts of Lancaster, it's other parts of town. And we decided, yes, that's the cleanest way to do it. There's other ways to do it, or there's also a decision to not do it, right? To leave the code the way it is, as far as billboards in this area. So looking for direction from the planning commission, I take it to city council. And if you're not ready to make a decision tonight and want more information, you can also make a motion to continue the hearing. If you want us to bring back more information or options or anything like that.
Commissioner Vogel.
Yeah, would it be reasonable to just add a provision to the like section saying that they could, in some circumstances, be relocated if that development happens on that site?
Yeah, I think most of the written testimony was requesting an option for people to build or redevelop and move it somewhere on their site. So that is one option. We could put that in there and say as long as it still meets the spacing and whatever, standards would generally apply. We can't bring back an overlay. I think that was the last testimony, just bring that overlay back. The council gave us a directive to get rid of all the overlays, which is why we did it. I guess the sign code could say no billboards in this area and have legal description. Just live in the sign code, it wouldn't be an overlay. It's kind of weird, but it's not like impossible to do. So yes, we could do that, or we could do something, different that just addresses this overlay. If that's what you want us to bring back a report and go through different options we can, or make a motion. Work on language here.
Anybody else? Couple of things that regarding my feelings about what we have in front of us. When I read this and I looked at billboards, I didn't know about the spacing, but I didn't really have any heartburn over them being in that zone. So I don't. I still haven't heard anything really compelling as to why they couldn't be there in the future, because they are intended to be a mix of retail with residential. I think leaning towards in the MU3 zone, and would support motion as being the big one. Making that change or suggesting that staff come back with that. I also think that it's worth asking that we have staff craft language around murals falling under the sign code. That's very summarized, but I think generally the topic is understood by all. So any thoughts? Do we have anybody, is anybody crafting a motion right now that you're just itching to bring forward?
I mean, if we need more discussion on the mural issue, I'm leaning against wanting to have that in the sign code just because we can't regulate content. It would open up the door to any mural being allowable, even if it wouldn't be allowed as a sign. So if I'm gonna make a motion, I would probably just make a motion to allow the existing non-conforming signs to be relocated within the site, but not allow murals unless there's further discussion.
I think as it relates to further discussion, sorry, Commissioner Senator, I didn't see you. There is provision in the code about signage, and you're not allowed to use profane language. It's not allowed to, I believe, express sexuality. There's several limitations in the code around signage already. So there's the phrase that I think Aaron used about not able to limit art content is only part of the story. I think there is some language that does protect that we're not going to have profanity painted in 20-foot letters on the side of the building. But I'd ask Aaron to maybe expand on that, and then I would go to Commissioner Slater.
Well, you're correct that we can't regulate content, and I'm gonna look to our assistant city attorney for maybe some advice. I know in general, the Oregon Constitution does grant a pretty broad allowance for freedom of speech.
Well, I'll have to go look at the provisions we have. You mentioned non-profanity and nudity, that kind of thing. I think that you're right that we'd be okay this wouldn't open the doors to widespread stuff like that, but I'd have to go back and check to make sure.
My concern would be more with like, you know, that someone could paint a massive political sign on the side of their building that wouldn't be able to be regulated or, you know, advertising sign that I think would be more consciously regulated within the existing sign code and by the Arts Commission. It's just-
We respect that, and I wish there was an easier way, because I think going to, it becoming public art is, in Salem from getting the murals. I wonder, not that it should be praised for a whole lot of things right now, but I was really impressed with how many murals I saw painted inside of buildings, or paint schemes that were clearly would be counted by our sign code as signage because it was intended to draw your attention, but it was a series of shapes, but it was beautiful, and it was the side of a 6-story building. So I would definitely support request to find some kind of language that allows this to move away from murals being public art. Commissioner Slade, you had comments.
Yeah, I don't have strong feelings on the billboard issue. I kind of could be persuaded either way on that. They're not my favorite thing to see in the world, but people have private property rights, and I just on that. But I think the art issue is very complex, obviously. And I'm not comfortable with the current regulation on it. Maybe it's something where the staff needs to do some more research on it. Maybe we need a work group in cooperation with the Public Arts Commission. But this just seems, you know, in some ways flawed. There's a flawed process going on in all of this. And I realize there's some constraints on how we can manage it in terms of the content. But this just all seems to be like a much deeper, complex conversation that maybe should happen in a different format. Just on the art component to it.
Commissioner Fogg.
So I'll touch on both issues. First, public art component, I completely agree. I think we need to find a way to simplify the process because, as you said, I think we are suffering from a lack of public art in the city, and that's something that really, you know, we should be encouraging as one element of beautifying Salem. And so, yes, agree, a work group and collaboration with PAC or something to that effect, I think would be maybe a route to achieve that. As for the billboards, I think my understanding of the intent with our Salem and the MU3 district is that it's recognizing that there are a lot more people who will eventually be living in there, and that's the hope. And supporting the same level of that pride of place and creating very vibrant and pedestrian focused communities that also have retail within them, I think is the larger intent and something that I would really like to encourage. I don't see billboards being something that contributes greatly to that. That is something that, generally speaking, is, you know, found on major highways, and I appreciate that that is something that currently exists. So as an element or as I guess an olive branch toward that, I would support the idea that you can relocate them within your site. I don't think that we should, I think we should adopt the currently proposed prohibition of as it's written.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I was just saying about the art commission, for the murals, it was a big topic at city council like a year ago, and we did have a work session on it. And Councilor Stapleton in particular, they dove into changes, and they made some changes. I think the murals only have to have 7-year easement now. It's a change the council recently made. But the council chose specifically not to open it up to you know, the ways we're talking about. We did talk to the councilors about it could be in the sign code, it could be, you know, you could just allow, and they were too concerned about unintended consequences in speech that we can't control. So the council decided not to make that change. last year. So I don't know that they would necessarily do this change, they will make that change this year, even if you recommend it. I just want to put that out there because it was quite a few meetings Aaron and I went to with our commission staff and the counselors. They did adopt the street painting mural project at the intersections. And put that in the code recently, and then I funded some of that, so some of the neighborhoods, right, you see the intersections that are painted, came out of that work. Council students and some of the other counselors, but they chose specifically not to open it up. That was like a year ago, so just want to throw that out there. Not to stymie these good ideas, but I just start thinking about those issues.
Commissioner Egas.
So I have a question. I have a stone wall that I built to separate my property from street, which used to just kind of. And I've thought about having someone paint a mural on it. It's about 6 stones high. Would I be allowed to have somebody paint a mural?
And the mural will be on the outside from what you can see from the street? No.
If there's no other comment, from what I've heard, I would propose a motion for discussion that we direct staff to amend their sign code to allow existing non-conforming billboard signs in the mixed-use zone to be relocated in the event of a site redevelopment. Do I have a second on that?
Second.
Discussion. Vote on the motion. Shelley, you take a vote.
Commissioner Augustine.
Aye.
Commissioner Egas.
Aye.
Commissioner Fott.
Aye.
Commissioner Vogel. Aye. Commissioner Levin.
Aye.
Commissioner Slater.
Aye.
Commissioner Vieira Brindle.
Aye.
Motion passes. Now, I believe we need a motion to approve the amended Salem Revised Code Chapter 900. Do I have a commissioner that would like to take that to me?
I'll move adoption of the staff report. That's
As amended.
as amended. As amended.
Do I have a second on that?
I'll second.
Seconded by Vaught. Shelley, will you?
Commissioner Augustine.
Aye.
Commissioner Egas.
Aye.
Commissioner Fott.
Aye.
Commissioner Vogel. Aye. Commissioner Levin.
Aye.
Commissioner Slater.
Aye.
And Commissioner Vieira Brindle.
Aye.
So I believe that concludes the public hearing on agenda item 5.1. We can move on to warp speed to agenda item 6.2, airport solar feasibility study motion. Commissioner Slater.
Thank you. And I'll just say my last vote was a mercy vote for the staff to not have to do that yet again. So, back in 2018, the Federal Aviation Administration put out a very helpful report identifying that the placement of solar and renewable energy infrastructure in at airports was in fact consistent with national goals for resiliency and national security and a number of other reasons. So that really clarified the fact that you could install solar. There had been some concerns previously of whether or not solar was appropriate for an airport, especially considering glare and other factors. So that issue has been resolved. There are a few design standards that the FAA has set, including the fact that solar panels need to be put south of the control tower, located south of the control tower, and then a glare study be done. But the overall question of whether solar is appropriate for airports has been resolved. And so that kind of raises the question here of whether it makes sense to look at solar placement in Salem. And I think the answer is very much that it does. Right now, Salem is undertaking a master plan for the airport. We're looking at expanding commercial service, we're looking at expanding additional general aviation service. We have a significant amount of land, some of it which is not developable because of airport restrictions and flight restrictions, as well as floodplain issues. And so to me, that strikes me as really a good opportunity to co-locate renewable energy in a space that might be less efficiently used. A number of airports now, the New York Times reports that 20% of all municipal airports have some solar. A few airports, including Chattanooga, Tennessee, have all of their electrical operation needs met by solar. Chattanooga has a 2.8 megawatt system that covers all of their operational needs, which is kind of cool. And so I think it's just a common sense recommendation that the city council use the opportunity of the master planning process to expand the scope a little bit and conduct a feasibility study for solar at the airport. While I don't think we want to engage in greenwashing, I think it does help sell the fact that we are potentially resuming commercial service there, and provides at least some sort of offset to the fact that we're going to be expanding potentially greenhouse gas emissions from the airport. And finally, there is a resiliency component to this, because if we integrate that with a microgrid and battery storage, then it's a potential to be able to function in a natural disaster situation, which I think is one of the real rationales that we have in Salem for having an airport. So this is very consistent with the purpose of the airport. I did talk with the airport general manager, who's there. Oh, hey, John. You're doing a great job. Within a day, responded to my emails, which is one of the things I love about Salem staff, is very responsive. And he thought that was a very good idea. I won't put words in your mouth, but very good idea. I did also bring up the climate change committee meeting. I think it was favorably received, but I just wanted to go ahead and see if we can get the imprimatur here of at least some other public body in Salem for that. And so I would make that motion. Shall we send a letter?
Thank you. Do we have a second on that motion?
Second.
Second is by Aegis, conversation.
Just a shout out, great job. I think this is a wonderful proposal and exciting stuff to be looking at.
Thanks. Commissioner Bond.
Also saying full support of the idea.
Commissioner Slater, you also have my full support behind this. I think this is very well crafted, well thought out idea. And it is well timed with the attempt to bring commercial air service back to the Salem Airport. And one of the things I appreciate about this approach is that the request was not to include and to force it into the project, but to request the feasibility. Is that diplomatic, political way of politely shoving, which with the right connections, the city of Salem is well poised for that addition to the airport that could easily be sourced by funds outside of what's needed to be allocated for bringing commercial air service back. Something that you might be interested to know is that Salem is a test site for microgrid studies by Portland General Electric. And they turned their small building over on 16th Street, right across from the city maintenance shops, into a test site. And as a part of Leadership Salem with the Chamber of Commerce, I got to go tour that this year and get a presentation about how they're studying microgrids and how they can best be placed and used in communities. So there's definitely some support, I think, from PGE on something like that to add generation. And then you might actually find that the Fly Salem group led by Brent Hart would actually be pretty supportive of this about what it would add to the city as far as the offsets and the electrical generation. So let's take a vote. Shall we call a vote?
Commissioner Augustine.
Aye.
Commissioner Egas.
Aye.
Commissioner Plott. Aye. Commissioner Goble. Aye. Commissioner Levin.
Aye.
Commissioner Slater.
Aye.
And Commissioner Vieira Rendell.
Aye.
So that concludes any discussion on item 6.2. We move on to 7, which is information reports. I see none is listed, but I also see Lisa is reaching for the mic, getting ready for her planning administrative support. Which are not in the great.
Sorry, I was just preparing, thank you. Upcoming meetings, on the flag sheet, we do have a comprehensive zone change piece on the 6th. And then we're having a presentation, on the Gilcrest project from Julie Warnke and the project manager will complete. And I don't think we have any items for the second June meeting yet, which will be the 7th, I think probably, yeah, the 27th, so that one's still open. Which we still have time, there might be cases. And then we're gonna have on July 18th, we have a goal 500 period inventory presentation by our natural resource planners. And then we've scheduled greenhouse gas inventory report update, with Henry Denke from Public Works on August 15th. And I'm supposed to point that out. And then, I just want to make sure that there aren't any commissioners that wanted to join the subcommittee that never responded. So this is what I have right now for responses on the energy efficiency, resilience, solar, subcommittee, Commissioner Slater, Commissioner Vieira, and Commissioner Ekus. We also thought they were on that, so we thought, okay. And then on riparian areas, natural resources, Commissioner Heller and Commissioner Vieira. Okay. And then on the community design standards, Commissioner Fox, All right.
We have a limit of 4, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Well, if they'll have me, I'm happy to serve on the design as well, but not always welcome, so just let me know.
We'll have you.
I make a request that design standards have a conversation about murals.
Okay, I'll send that out in an email, following this meeting, just so everybody knows that is on the subcommittee. And,
Then I can alternate for Slater. It's fine.
so I guess the other two do have room, there to, subcommittee, so somebody changes their mind and wants to get on board, just let me know, but otherwise, that's what we have, for now. That's everything I had, thank you.
I have one question, as always, Ms. Anderson, oh, I'm sorry. Are there any, in our tax increment districts, our improvement districts, do we have any resiliency or energy standards when we make grants or other sorts of awards to builders in that area?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know of any, but I can ask our economic development staff. It's more focused on affordability. I know downtown they changed it so they give grants for lighting and security. You know, we changed, we do in planning give grants for historic houses, toolbox grants. We have about $10,000 to $15,000 a year. We give out grants up to $1,000, so it's very small. Our little planning, more a small amount of money to help people, you know, kind of offset the cost of maintaining historic properties. But the HLC added in energy efficiency and resiliency. Recently, we updated our code to allow to make it clear that you can do things like solar panels on historic houses, just to say like where it needs to be, not be. So we can get that pretty easily. And so we've had a few people and we've had one grant cycle where we cover that now. So we've had a few houses at solar panels. So we're excited about that. But that's just so small scale, right? So yeah, I'll ask and I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. Just one other question, which just went out of my head. Never mind.
So we are at comments through to the order. Commissioner Ekus.
Sorry, nobody wants to go, but I'm gonna try not to beat a dead horse too much. It has to do with the lawn signs, temporary signs. And if you recall, when this first came up a long time, I asked about why we couldn't regulate, why we just said 60 days and couldn't regulate lawn signs in a period that was specific to the election, with the idea that there was a specific time that you could allow after the election, they could stay up, and then after the election, you had to take them down. At the time, the
staff attorney indicated that there was some free speech issues with that and they couldn't be treated differently. Didn't make sense to me, so I did some research. Found out that, yeah, there are court cases that have said that you can't treat political signs different than other signs. There are some other countervailing court cases that indicate it might be possible and logical to make a case that, well, the 60-day requirement applies to everybody because you got a specific date related to the election that you could apply to that. However, I concluded that while there are a number of cities in Oregon that have somewhat have that kind of approach that could be challengeable in court, it hasn't been, but as long as the staff attorneys had the opinion that they did, that it wasn't really worth pursuing or trying to do. That's just background history, support the idea to understand why the staff attorneys have their opinion. In fact, there was one in Supreme Court in Washington that made it pretty clear that it couldn't do what I've been talking about doing. But what it did then lead me to was to the conclusion that bothers me, and I don't know if there's any resolution to it. We have this 60-day requirement, and it's for two non-consecutive 60 days, which I assume in part is related to the fact that we have primary and general elections. So that accommodates those periods that we really don't have any, other than the right-of-way issue, we don't have any enforcement of temporary sign or lawn signs particularly, because we never know when someone puts it up. And it's just a note to make it. What it does is reinforce my feeling that the real enforcement we have is over the right-of-way issue. What I think we ought to concentrate on. But you know, I see Jesus Saves and Black Lives Matter signs that are up all year long. Doesn't really bother me. I focus on the political signs because they all of a sudden they come up once and there's a lot of them. And that's why we tend to want to regulate the 60 days. But I've just come to the conclusion that we have, other than right away, we've got a lawn sign, some rules that I think people in elections generally realize that, you know, 60 days I'll start putting my lawn signs in. But we really, for other lawn signs, we just don't really have any way because it's 60-day limit. You kind of have to know when they put it up. And we don't. So I think that's just a reality of it. But it does reinforce my feeling that the only true way, when it comes to the real enforcement we have, is on the right way aspect.
Thank you for sharing. Any other comments for good of the order? Seeing none, I will look to the galley. No public insight, no public comment, waiting for critics, and I will close the hearing.